Eventually, Don came to a stop to consult the map once more. A look of intense displeasure crossed his face as he looked over his course.
Figures. I knew we should have crossed Three Forks already.
He cast an uneasy glance back towards the others.
Looks like Thraxis found us. The map's changed again.
The others crowded in around Don, jostling one another in the rush for a look. Wil and Chrissy perched on Don's head, while Ganor fluttered over to his shoulder, and Elizabeth and Farrago gathered close at his sides. The Father of Thousands reared up on his hind limbs, swaying back and forth as he fought for a better view, while Stubbo clambered up the great spider's back.
Beast Bridge,
Don read aloud.
I hope someone knows what that means, 'cause we're headed right for it.
Ganorf and Farrago locked eyes, the same look of concern mirrored in their faces. Farrago was the first to speak.
The Beast Man?
Ganorf nodded with a sigh. I had hoped we wouldn't have to tangle with him.
Yeah, this is my first time off Warlock's path.
Don spoke up.
Either of you want to explain this to ignorant little me?
Farrago gulped and looked to Ganorf.
You want to tell him, or should I?
I will, Ganorf answered. Turning to face each of his companions in turn, Ganorf began. The story of the Beastman is one of tragedy and the death of innocence. You see, these woods were green and good once, before the Lord of Blades came and brought with him power-hungry warlocks like Thraxis.
That was when Wizzy ruled,
Farrago added. Indeed, Ganorf agreed, haughtily rubbing a wing against his chest. I have always ruled with justice and mercy. It is only natural the forest should flourish beneath me. Don forcefully cleared his throat, drawing the wizard back to the subject at hand.
And this Beastman?
Ganorf's face grew somber. The Beastman is the last son of a cursed lineage. His ancestors made their home here, hunting and foraging in the lost green days of old. When the wood was tainted, so too was his family. One by one they turned feral, and killed one another off. The strongest and most cunning among them is all that remains. It is he whom we call the Beastman.
And you don't want to mess with him,
Farrago added.
There's something unnatural about the guy. I hear a knight once tracked him down and cut his head off. Then old Beastie Boy just puts his head back on and stoves in the knight's helmet with his own shield.
Farrago, Ganorf barked. Clearing his throat, he added, Let's stick to the facts, shall we? There's a very aggressive wild man somewhere up ahead, and the rumors of his immense regenerative powers are simply that. Rumors.
Lovely,
Don grunted.
Anything else we should know?
Ganorf's brow furrowed, and he shifted his weight uneasily from one foot to the other. Well, there is one thing, hardly worth mentioning. Don glanced irritably to his shoulder.
Well, spit it out.
You have to understand, it's only local legend. More myth than legend, really. Farrago broke in.
They say he can be tamed by the pure of heart.
Don instinctively looked aside to Elizabeth, flashing a wry smile.
Sounds like someone we know, eh?
Elizabeth nodded.
Think he'll recognize you?
Elizabeth took a deep breath as she thought about it.
I sure hope so.
Well, if y'all ask me,
Stubbo interjected.
Not that anyone has, but I'd rather not find out, you know? Who's with me?
Ganorf, Farrago, and even the Father of Thousands raised their hands in assent, except for the Father of Thousands, who was raising someone else's hand.
I want to see him, Wil shouted. It's been too long since we had a good monster.
Chrissy shuddered.
Not me.
As much as I'd like to side with Chrissy on this one, I don't think we'll have a choice.
Don added.
The rest of you, try to slip past him while I keep him busy.
I'm not leaving you.
Elizabeth insisted.
Not again.
Don smirked with a light chuckle.
Then who's going to watch the kids?
He motioned to the others.
These bozos?
I resent that,
Stubbo barked. The Father of Thousands agreed.
Then we're agreed.
Don concluded.
No one'll miss me if I don't make it.
I will.
Elizabeth retorted. Don paused in thought for a time.
Right. This is all about you, after all.
What?
Elizabeth began to protest, but Don cut her off.
I'm serious. You're the dreamer. We're the dreams.
Don shrugged, a resigned look on his face.
Well, you wanted adventure. This is it. I defer to your judgment, Princess.
Elizabeth was silent for a time. At last she spoke up.
We'll jump off that bridge when we come to it.
Don took another look at the map.
Well, that may be sooner than we thought. It looks like the path is straightening out.
Indeed, Ganorf concurred. These trees are always listening. We left the last good tree behind. These ones have all allied with Theraxis. The moment Ganorf said it, he was answered with a faint murmuring. Anywhere else it would have appeared no more than a breeze rustling through the leaves and rattling the branches, but in that bleak forest it may as well have been the voices of thousands upon thousands of conspirators.
Charybdis and Scylla.
Don mused.
Well, Odysseus had to choose between two dangers, and so do we. Time to move.
With that, Don led off down the path, Elizabeth close at his heels, and Stubbo and Farrago close at hers, with the Father of Thousands bringing up the rear.
Elizabeth,
Stu whispered.
if y'all don't mind me asking, what's a Charybdis?
One of the two monsters guarding a perilous strait.
Elizabeth explained.
In Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, the hero had to choose which one to face. Scylla would devour 7 of his crew. Charybdis would swallow his ship whole.
And he couldn't just turn around and go home?
Elizabeth shook her head.
That was the way home.
Stubbo gulped.
Sounds like it was time to get a new home.
Elizabeth smiled ruefully.
If only it were that simple.
The Beast Bridge was aptly named. Ancient, petrified, shining ivory in a lonely ray of sunlight, it stretched across a deep ravine, the last remnants of some creature lying where it had been slain long ago. A swift, deep river roared far below, and ancient horn-like ribs rose high above. The trees gave way abruptly. Many loomed over the side of the ravine, their black, tentacle-like roots protruding from the cliffside. Several had been lodged in the ravine below, giant wooden beams stretching from one side to the other after the earth gave way beneath them. There was very little space to walk on either side. The only path was straight forward, and even that path was narrow and difficult.
This don't look good,
Stubbo muttered. Don's brow furrowed in displeasure.
Ganorf, isn't a bridge supposed to be, an actual bridge?
The parrot wizard shrugged. Don't look at me. I didn't build it. Elizabeth shuddered as she peered over the edge.
At least we know there isn't a troll living under it.
Don grunted and peered across the bridge.
Then where's this beast man, I wonder?
He rolled up the map and pressed it into Elizabeth's hands.
Don?
I'm going to scout ahead.
He explained.
The rest of you stay back.
Elizabeth, however, clung to Don's arm.
No, I won't lose you again.
Don hesitated, gazing into Elizabeth's eyes for a time. Then he flashed a wry grin and patted her on the cheek.
Likewise.
With that, he pried Elizabeth's hands away, and readying his bow, he ventured out onto the bridge. As he stalked along the giant's spine, Don scanned the tree line on either bank. The dark branches betrayed nothing of what may have hidden above. His gaze turned to the opposite bank. There was nothing there but a bare patch of ground, roughly 7 feet across. It was an ideal spot for an ambush. Don glanced back the way he had come. All he saw was the blue of Elizabeth's eyes looking back at him.
Is it safe?
She called out. She was answered by a bestial roar, which echoed and thundered so badly off the sides of the ravine there was no telling what direction it came from. Don rolled his eyes to the sky and heaved a sigh of disgust.
Liz, how many times will it take before you learn?
Elizabeth cut him off with a terrified scream.
Behind you!
It was, to be frank, more above than behind, but Elizabeth's warning got the job done. Don whirled about just in time to see and to dodge as it came leaping from the branches, twigs snapping and flying in its wake. It was a bear, or perhaps it was a man. It was a bear man. It landed with a crash and a roar, a giant stone axe smashing into the bridge where Don had been standing just a moment before. Aside from a loincloth and a bearskin slung across his shoulders, the remains of the animal's mouth resting atop his scalp, the beast man was nearly naked. He wore no armor, not even boots or gauntlets. It took Elizabeth a moment to even notice the beast man's real face. Much of it was obscured behind his immense beard and shaggy hair. Don came up quickly behind his adversary, letting an arrow fly at the beast man's back. The twang of his bowstring, however, was met with a click and a clatter, as the arrow crashed headlong into a jagged shield shaped from the scaly hide of some dead reptile. The shield was enormous, nearly as tall and broad as the shoulders of the beast man himself, and as that shield turned aside, it revealed the stormy, burning gaze of its enraged wielder. Don leapt backwards as the stone axe swept forward again. It was followed up with a swipe from the shield's saw-like edge as the beast man spun. Cloth was torn and blood flew as the shield tore across Don's cheek. He staggered and fell. Next, the axe came around again, arcing high, and came crashing down. Don rolled aside, just narrowly avoiding the edge. With a roar, the beast man leapt for his prone adversary, bringing the shield down in what would have been a lethal punch. It took a bit of hair off the top of Don's head, but the wily knight managed to scramble between the feral madman's legs. There was a howl, more of rage than pain, as Don's bow whipped upwards, snapping through the loincloth as he passed. A rib snapped in two, tumbling into the river below, as the enraged beast man whipped his axe about. Don managed to roll forward just in time to avoid the shield's razor edge.
"Hey, Mr. Wizard!"
Don shouted.
"Is there something you can do about this guy?"
For a moment, Genorf stammered, unintelligibly. The eyes of the beast man seared his very soul, every time they rose from behind that shield. At long last, Genorf managed to blurt out,
Isn't that your department? You're the knight!
Don ducked beneath the stone axe as it sent another rib tumbling into the river below.
"I don't know if you've noticed, but arrows and daggers aren't much good against this behemoth."
What about you?
Farrago suggested to Elizabeth. Elizabeth stared back at him in disbelief.
Me? What can I do?
You're the princess, aren't you? Genorf added.
Pure of heart and all that,
Farrago continued.
Actually, I'm not all that pure.
Farrago paused for a moment.
Well, yeah, but you're real nice.
Genorf nodded his agreement. Another arrow ricocheted off the beast man's shield. In the brief moment the great wild man hid behind it, Don darted past him, and quick as a flash, drew a dagger and drove it under the beast man's nearest shoulder blade. With a roar, the feral giant whirled about. Don rolled forward, avoiding the axe head, and shot an arrow as the beast man came around once more. There was another howl as the arrow ran through the beast man's left bicep. Foam dribbled from the beast man's mouth, his shoulders rising and falling as he breathed heavily. Both arms had gone limp from pain, but the beast man wasn't ready to surrender. Before Don could knock another arrow, the beast man gave a final howl and charged for him, teeth flashing in the dim light, feet pounding against the ancient vertebrae. Don bent low, bow held horizontally, and met the beast man head-on. The bow caught the beast man just under his knees, while Don rammed his shoulder into the giant's stomach. Now Don roared as he gave a great heave and flipped the beast man clear over his back. There was a thunderous crash as the beast man landed, followed by a low groan, and he ceased to fight. Don let out a groan of his own and fingered his side.
"I think I overdid it."
Elizabeth rushed from the cover of the tree line, overcome with relief.
Are you all right? How bad is it?
Don sank to the ground and let out a heavy breath.
"Yeah, I'm okay. Just fine."
He grunted as he felt the cut across his cheek.
"I'm just not sure I'll be walking much for a while."
Matrix?
Elizabeth called back. The great spider crossed his four forelimbs and shook his head.
Oh, fine. Father of thousands. Do you think you could carry him?
The The Father of Thousands lowered his gaze, and after a moment's hesitation, he shrugged and scurried forward, nearly running down Farrago and Stubbo in the process.
Hey!
Stubbo shouted after him.
Watch where y'all are going!
Ditto! Farrago chimed in. The Father of Thousands ignored both of them. Elizabeth threw one of Don's arms over her shoulder and helped him to his feet. When the Father of Thousands arrived, Elizabeth helped to heave Don over the spider's head and onto his back. Elizabeth gave Don a kiss on the cheek, and then sent the spider and his rider on their way. Stubbo jumped with a yelp of fright at the sound of a sudden growl and snarl as he passed the prone beast man. Farrago was a bit more cautious, clambering along the ribs to give the beast man the widest possible berth. Elizabeth hesitated for a time. Her heart pounded at the thought of how close she would have to come to her fallen foe. Even defeated, the beast man was still an enormous, muscular figure. His biceps were the size of butchered pigs, his arms as thick and strong as tree trunks. Elizabeth could just imagine him springing back to life and dragging her off as she passed. Yet just as Elizabeth was about to finally make her move, the beast man stirred once more. It began with a wail, a terrified, agonized wail that would have shaken even a banshee to its core. The beast man released his axe, leaving it to tumble down against several ribs, and he did reach out, just not for Elizabeth. As large and strong as he may have been, the beast man was far from flexible. The dagger in his back was just beyond his reach. Elizabeth's fear faded as she watched the beast man fumble about, whimpering all the while like a small dog that had been kicked a few times too many. For all his bulk and fury, there was something very vulnerable about him. Elizabeth was reminded of a child that had just skinned his knee. As quietly as she could manage, Elizabeth crept closer. The sound of her rushing blood pulsed in her ears as she drew within arm's reach of the feral giant. There it was, buried up to the hilt under his shoulder blade, Don's offending dagger. The moment an opening presented itself, Elizabeth's hand shot out, seized the little weapon, and wrenched it free of the beast man's flesh. There was a thunderous roar of pain as the dagger ripped free, and before Elizabeth's very eyes, the wound sealed itself. Without another thought, Elizabeth dashed past the wild man, making for the far end of the bridge. Behind her, Elizabeth could hear the heavy motions of the beast man regaining his feet and retrieving his axe. Then the sounds of pursuit began. Elizabeth threw a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. She saw the beast man, large as life, the arrow gone from his now fully healed arm, charging after her. Elizabeth screamed as she looked ahead once more. Several sets of eyes glanced Elizabeth's way. Farrago gave a yelp of fright and urged the Father of Thousands into a quicker pace. For the great spider, the frontmost of the group, blocked any further travel down the path. As such, no one ran faster than the Father of Thousands, unless they wanted to try to slip between his legs. Don, however, was the odd one out.
"Wait!"
he shouted.
"Wait for Liz!"
The others ignored him. When Elizabeth stumbled on a protruding root, she felt her mind roll its eyes in disgust. How many times had she read about such nonsense in her cheaper books, and been disgusted at the characters' utter stupidity? Unlike those characters, Elizabeth wasn't about to let a fall stop her. Yet the time it took her to scramble back to her feet was time enough for the beast man to close the distance between them. In an instant he was upon her. Or, rather, as Elizabeth found when she regained her footing, the beast man was upon one knee. His head was bowed, leaving only the lifeless eyes of his hood to gaze back up at Elizabeth. The great stone battle-axe was dipped towards the ground, and likewise the monstrous shield. Elizabeth's head spun as she heaved a sigh of relief.
Well, let's hear it for the peer of heart.
She glanced over her shoulder. The others had faded from sight. Looking back to the beast man, she added,
You're welcome, I guess.
Jabbing a thumb over her shoulder, Elizabeth began to back away.
I have to be going. Goodbye.
As Elizabeth turned away and rushed off down the path, she heard the sound of low grunting at her heels. The beast man had hopped back up and now followed after her. After a time, Elizabeth stopped and turned back, fully intending to hold up her hand in a stop gesture. Much to her surprise, she found her palm pressed firmly against the beast man's gargantuan chest. Elizabeth quickly withdrew her hand and took a step back.
Right. You can go now. It's all right. No harm done.
The beast man promptly dropped to one knee and bowed his head.
Okay,
Elizabeth mused. Cupping the beast man's chin in her hands, she attempted to explain.
Look, I'm just trying to get...
Yet as Elizabeth looked into the giant's eyes, her words died in her throat. Those eyes were deep, sad, and soulful, like the eyes of a big dog. Suddenly he didn't seem to be such a giant anymore. If anything, as Elizabeth gazed into his eyes, he appeared to be getting smaller. His axe and shield faded into nothing. The bare skin on his back melded into his skin. Soon he only came up to Elizabeth's knees, and she found herself looking into the face of a tiny, whimpering cocker spaniel.
Okay,
Elizabeth mumbled.
I never saw that coming.
As she heaved the little dog into her arms, the animal leaned his head against Elizabeth's shoulder. She could feel him shaking as she held him.
Well, welcome to the crew, I guess.
Meanwhile, not too much further down that same path, there was chaos of a different sort in progress. There were no wild men barking, nor monsters howling. There was, however, Don.
Are you people kidding me?
He had been shouting.
Oh, we're all behind you, Princess. Oh, we're coming along. You need magical protection.
He paused just long enough to catch his breath and fire a glare worthy of Elizabeth, Ganorf, and Farrago's way. Then he turned his audio wrath on Stubbo.
And what about you, Shorty, eh? After she let you come along and rescue you from a spider's web? You just went off on your own.
Stubbo set his fists against his hips, indignantly.
Well, what about you? Y'all just rode on away the moment Beastie Boys start screaming again.
Next, Don glared between his legs, his gaze nearly burning a hole in the Fathers of Thousands carapace.
Yeah, and what about that? And after she let you tag along too.
The Father of Thousands squeaked back. Such was the scene when Elizabeth finally caught up. She hung back for a time in the shadows just to watch. As Don grew increasingly belligerent, however, she concluded that enough was enough. Elizabeth stepped forward and loudly cleared her throat. Stubbo had been just about to draw his sword and challenge when he heard the sound. The little man's voice died in his throat, and his arm froze mid-motion. Glancing over his shoulder, he murmured,
Lisbeth!
Liz?
Don exclaimed. He fumbled his way to the edge of the spider's back, but winced in pain as he moved.
Stay where you are.
Elizabeth called.
I'm coming.
Ganorf gaped in awe as Elizabeth rushed past him. You survived! How? Elizabeth paused, glancing the wizard's way, and rubbed the dog's shoulder with one hand.
I tamed him. The legends were true, it appears.
Tamed by the pure of heart?
Farrago piped up.
I thought you said you weren't so pure.
Hush!
Elizabeth quipped.
He doesn't know that.
He who?
Farrago asked. Elizabeth nuzzled the back of the dog's neck for emphasis.
He him?
Elizabeth rushed ahead to Don and the Father of Thousands.
Well,
She asked.
what's next?
Don said nothing for a time. He was utterly dumbstruck by the vision before him. Elizabeth passed the map back to him. At last, Don nodded.
Yeah, right, of course.
Without another word, he unrolled the aged parchment and took stock of their progress.
Not much further, looks like. We should be emerging from the Blackwood soon.
Then let's be on our way.
Elizabeth commanded.
Sheesh!
Farrago mumbled to Ganorf.
Not even a queen, and she's already giving orders.
But the adventure was far from over. Not far behind, Elizabeth was pursued. A claw-like finger scratched against the surface of the beast bridge, tracing the outline of the freshest cuts and gouges in its surface. Thraxis sneered in annoyance as he noted the complete lack of blood on the scene. Nearby, tiny bladelings crawled along the surface of the ancient bones, not unlike flies swarming over a carcass. Thraxis reached a hand down a small pouch hanging from his belt and retrieved a fistful of steel dust. Once more he inhaled a clump. By now his throat had grown scarred and tough from the punishment subjected to it by the Lord of Blade's essence. The whites of Thraxis' eyes turned a blood red as the dust flooded his heart and veins, cutting and tearing every inch of him as it coursed through his body. Thraxis shuddered but did not fall. After performing his little ritual several times over, he had grown accustomed to the pain. He closed his eyes and waited. A sharp pain flared up in his back, and his features shifted and protruded as tiny blades pushed outwards from within his hollow, black cuts. A jagged hump swelled under his torn robe, rising and pushing outwards with a terrible screeching, and then they burst free. 2 metal limbs protruded from Thraxis' shoulders, unfolding in a series of sword-like blades. Steel wings, stretching and spreading behind him. "Bladelings," Thraxis rasped. "Fly!" A single mighty flap of his new wings sent Thraxis shooting straight up, followed by a swarm of blades. From that height, the whole of the Blackwood spread out before him, and in the distance there rose a shining white citadel on a hilltop. Thraxis' brow furrowed in hatred as he laid eyes on it, but the corners of his mouth tugged into a painful yet irresistible grin. "I'm coming, brother." He wasn't the only one either. It wasn't long before the Blackwood gave way to a broad meadow, and beyond that an open grassy plain. After so many hours in the bleak shadows of the wood, Elizabeth found the golden light of the setting sun to be blinding. But like clean water washing the blood from an open wound, it was a cleansing sting, as her eyes adjusted from a world of darkness to one of light. Though she had to shield her eyes, Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She rushed out into the yellowed, golden grasses, laughing aloud from sheer relief. The beast-man dog leapt from her arms, darting in circles around Elizabeth with many a liberated bark and a pant. The fairies, Wil and Chrissy, emerged from Elizabeth's hair and darted through the grass, wheeling high overhead and diving low to trip up the others. The Father of Thousands scuttled forward with renewed vigor. Stubbo dashed into the open, pausing to take a deep breath, and then hurtling onward as fast as his short legs could carry him. Don kicked his heels against the spider's sides, as if urging a horse into a full gallop, and waved his hands over his head with a hoot of joy. There were only 2 among them who remained somewhat subdued.
"Think we should tell them?"
Farrago asked. "What?" Genorf muttered back. "That the only people left are the king, the bishop, and a few loyal guards?" Farrago nodded.
"I guess we can wait."
"Indeed."